Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, fueling the Satanic Panic, I've got a review of Dead Air by Bob Larson. So Bob Larson is someone I hadn't heard of until recently when I was listening to a podcast, Things Fell Apart, by John Ronson, which was discussing the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic being a wave of kind of moral hysteria in the US in particular in kind of the late 70s and 80s, where Satanism and the concept of ritual abuse led to thousands of false allegations of abuse against people, particularly people working in daycare centres, and also a lot of discussion of like the role of like heavy metal music and things like that, and Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of thing, in corrupting America's youth. So it's an interesting period. Moral panics are always terrible things, in my opinion, because people get whipped up into a state of hysteria that stops them from thinking rationally and logically about accusations that are put in front of them, and that can often lead to miscarriages of justice, as it did during the Satanic Panic. So the Satanic Panic is something I think nowadays we tend to look back of as almost like something that was quite funny, people getting all worried about heavy metal music and things like that. But in reality, there were innocent victims of it. There were people who were imprisoned and had their lives ruined because of false allegations. So it's worth considering that when we look back at the Satanic Panic. So anyway, Bob Larson was a televangelist and radio host who very much challenged heavy metal music in particular and talked about satanic links to heavy metal bands. He also does things like performing exorcisms live on air. I will link in the description to this video to a video on YouTube of him doing that on his radio show. So it's not a video you can watch, it's a video you can listen to, if that makes sense. But yeah, so an interesting character, and also someone who, as a radio host, had lots of people call into him making accusations, not against him, but against other people, of ritual abuse, satanic abuse and things like that. And those accusations caused him to write a number of non-fiction books about the subject, and also this novel, Dead Air. So this book contains fictionalised versions of true stories that were told to Larson that he believed to be true about satanic cults and things like that. Now, whether Bob Larson actually wrote this book or not is another matter. Apparently, it was written by, and the name of the person is quoted in the acknowledgements at the front of the book. I think it's Laurie Bosflug, who was someone who worked on his team. Apparently, she wrote most of this book. I think he probably came up with some of the ideas, but it was effectively ghost-written. So what's the book about? So the book is about a radio host who has a young girl call into his talk radio show and claim that she's being abused. He manages to track her down. Her story kind of resonates with him. He manages to track her down and rescues her from a satanic cult, and thereafter manages to find her mother as well, and goes on a campaign to take down this cult. And it's one of those stories that works well as a thriller, because it's one of those things where you never know who else in the town. He lives and works in a small town. You never know who else in the town is part of the cult, and that kind of trope works really well in thrillers. So for the first half, at least, this is actually quite an effective and enjoyable thriller. It definitely goes off the boil a bit towards the end, as it gets the conspiracy gets larger and larger, and the way that the central character brings things to a head at the end is somewhat ridiculous. But it was still quite an enjoyable thriller. But it got me thinking about the way that trashy fiction, and this is definitely trashy fiction. So this is something that was ghost written, that cashes in on a moral panic, and that uses tried and tested thriller techniques to turn this moral panic into a piece of entertainment. So it's definitely what I would consider to be trashy fiction. But I think trashy fiction definitely has a role in perpetuating moral panics. So, this did it. There are other, a lot of other horror novels and things like that about satanic abuse that came out in the 80s. Over here in the UK, we had, a wave of books in the 70s that cashed in on people's fears about youth culture. So books like Skinhead by Richard Allen and its many sequels really cashed in on public fear about the way they perceived young people as being out of control. So trashy fiction, always, or not always, often has a part to play in perpetuating moral panics. And I think that's because trashy fiction cashes in on whatever is big at the time when the book is written. It perpetuates the status quo. It tries to make a quick buck out of the newspaper headlines of the day. So it's kind of a natural symbiotic relationship between the news and trash fiction, which I find fascinating as a reader, but it can also be problematic when you get books like this that continue to fuel the fire of false allegations and things like that. So it's kind of the equivalent of what we would call fake news in today's world, fake stories circulating on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, because people get sucked in by the headlines because they've heard about things like that happening, and they kind of thoughtlessly, without necessarily even reading articles, share articles that perpetuate lies. And that is definitely something that I think trashy fiction can be guilty of as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not fun to read. And Dead Air was an entertaining slice of time novel. And it's that kind of nostalgia thing about older vintage trashy fiction that really appeals to me. There's something about looking back at the mindset of a population at the time a book came out, the mindset of society, which I think is really, really interesting. And Dead Air is a very good example of that kind of thing. So do I recommend that you rush out and buy a copy of Dead Air? Probably not, but if you're interested in the Satanic Panic, you might find it an interesting read. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there and say, as always, thanks very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.